All right, let's pray together. God, together we come before you praying your 19th Psalm, that everything we let go into our hearts and think about and ponder and meditate upon, that becomes the things that generate the words of our mouths, that all of our thoughts and all of our words would somehow come together to be pleasing to you, to build up and to encourage, that we might see stars in the sky that we couldn't have seen without those thoughts and without those words, not only in our lives, but in those we encounter in our daily walk. In your name we give you thanks. Amen. This morning we ask the question, what do the Magi do? It is so tempting to read the scriptures Haley read to us this morning and focus on King Herod, who is actually a tetrarch, to place all of our attention on one of the most evil people in all of creation, because I think most of us like the idea that no matter how bad we may have been, there's somebody worse and they're in the Bible. Now, as that might help us feel better, I think it kind of misses the point, and actually probably isn't really that helpful, because this morning we're going to focus on the stars of the story, the Magi. Last year, we had a new member join our church, several of them. She is from a Germantown church very nearby. I didn't know her story, but I was incredibly impressed at this lunch by her conviction. You could tell she had been hurt. I didn't know who or what had hurt her, but she had only one interest, in telling me what she was about and in answering her questions. Now, I learned later what her story was, and every single one of you, if you knew what her story would have, she had every right to bash her old church. Not one word ever bashing anybody has come out of her mouth. Instead, I wrote down a few years ago, you know what I like about Kingsway? She asked me, I said, no. She said, the church tells me what to be for and not what to be against. I thought, at our best, we do that. I hope we do that all the time. It's what we live for and who we live for, not what we live against. The Magi are the central story. I think it's what they do. They tell us more what they are for than who they are against. It's the story of Epiphany, the season in the church where we focus on light and following stars and avoiding bad jokes if you have my last name and what you are for. In the last week, we have all had lots of chances to make lots of choices to this end. One of these choices is this. Are we going to put more energy towards what we are for in this world and called to than that which we are against and possibly that which we hate? We all have that choice. You only get so much energy. Where are we going to put it? What you're called and gifted to do or that which you're not? Now, it might surprise you, and I don't know that anybody else has said this, but Wednesday was my favorite day of the whole year because it is actually the day of Epiphany. 12 days, depending on how you count, or 13 after Christmas. I almost forgot it was my favorite day, of course, until I did my job, opened my Bible, read this text, started on the sermon, and realized something. We have a countervalence of a distinctly Christian story to tell. Now look, like all of you, I have many strong gifts and callings, and I have many more that are not mine. Being a news anchor, being a journalist, being a scientist, being a political pundit is not what I'm good at, is not my calling, is not my job, and I have no interest in it becoming that. But being a preacher, just like Pastor Sandra, for someone who proclaims what God is for and inspires us to be the best of our callings in this world, that's what we are for. No matter what the world did to Epiphany, it doesn't change the story that God incarnated into our scriptures and into the church. It's a season that we celebrate the story of Matthew 2, when Jesus is manifested to the Gentiles after a long journey to find him. They worship him and give him gifts. Some have rightly called it the season of lights because it's the brightly shining light, the brilliant star in the east that lead the wise men to Jesus. We know the story well. We sing about it. Anne plays beautiful preludes about it. Children act it out. And it's included in every manger scene of figurines I've ever seen in my life. There are always wise men at the manger. Now, that may make no biblical or historical sense, but that's for another time. This morning is about the things we are for, not just things we are against. Sometimes stories sound so familiar. I think it's kind of easy to just gloss over them. Oh, I've heard the story of the wise men since I was a child, and we just skip over it because we already know it. And sometimes when we do that, we miss the last verse. Sometimes it's also easy to miss the real point. One of the major misconceptions of our world is very similar to when this was written. It's these binary understandings of darkness and light. In the West, just like in ancient Greece, we simply say, well, darkness is bad and light is good. It's quite simple that way. I would contend the history of this tradition challenges us to find a different view. I think it does so in the most beautiful of ways. I've mentioned before that the church has always had Lent, basically since its beginning, celebrated the death and resurrection of Jesus. We call this Easter, and it's based on a lunar calendar. It's why I never have any clue when Easter is going to be. Julius Caesar formed what's called the Julian calendar, but the problem was he thought there were 362 days instead of 365 days, which obviously creates a problem that gets complicated several hundred years later. This worked well in the early church. It was mainly a Mediterranean phenomenon in the ancient Near East and some in North Africa. But then in the 4th century, the church starts to spread to the north, where it had never been before, into the Celtic lands. Now, it's not just the land of Guinness and that little country up there, but it's actually from Ireland all the way to Turkey, only north of the Alps. That was the Celtic lands and the Celtic culture, a culture that was entirely sun-based. In oversimplified terms, this was a season. They had 4 seasons: season of planting, season of growing, a season of harvest, a season of rest, and darkness. Darkness wasn't bad. It was looked forward to in the north. It was the finish line of all of their work and labor and the starting light to their rest. It was celebrated. It was a time of rest, to be still from harvest until the solstice on December 25th. So Christians came with a message of death and resurrection that overlaid a message with the cycle of the earth and the cycle of Christian faith. It's how we get the beginnings of the Christian calendar, things like Epiphany. It's really such a beautiful story. Early Christians took the central message of a cross and the resurrection, and they made sense of it in a way that honored and respected the culture and traditions of people very different than their own. At its best, that's what Christianity is. Christianity adds to people's lives and cultures. Its central role is to add and to build up, not to take away or to hate. In the north, everything is integrated. The people, the seasons, the water, the land, even fire is integrated. They're forced to come together so they can survive for another year. In the south, it can be much more binary. It makes sense. There's light and dark, right and wrong, law and order, in and out, us and them, citizen and non-citizen, lawless and justice. The idea of Advent comes from the north, the solstice. Literally, the solstice is when the sun stands still. They almost always, in the middle of their towns, put a huge oak tree, the very center. They thought it was the place that lightning would first strike, so they would have a warning. It also later becomes the place they would hang candles and fruit, which is the beginning, of course, of the Christmas tree. Darkness wasn't a bad thing, and it still isn't, but a cycle that marked a time of rest and recreation, a time to slow down and go dormant, to prepare for the next year, to reflect on the last year. They looked forward to darkness, stillness, solemnity. They looked forward to a time where equanimity was possible. They spoke of lights in the most beautiful phrase, as a way to decorate the darkness. No sense of a Jewish moon calendar, only a spiritual sense that there is a God of all creation that cares for us. The Christians later learned, well, the calendar was 3 days off. Actually, Christmas isn't on the 25th, but the 22nd with the solstice. So the Pope said, well, we didn't make a mistake. That's even more beautiful. 3 days later, we'll have Christmas, the coming of Christ. Alexander Shia, who's a great, famous cultural Celtic anthropologist, writes these words. I've shared them once before. He says this: the deepest dark is not the place grace goes to die. The deepest dark is the place grace goes to be reborn. The deepest dark is not the place grace goes to die. It's the place grace goes to be reborn. That's what the preacher thinks. That's what I think about last week. Now it's our job to live out the reality of our faith with all of our gifts and all of our calling to be the best that we are to one another. When suffering and darkness and diagnoses and danger come, we don't have to despair because we are never alone. We are with one another. We can always find ways to decorate the darkness, but we can't always do it alone. I had to ask Ann this morning, how long ago did you move? Because that's how long I've had a Christmas tree. She said it was 6 years ago. It doesn't seem like 6 years ago, but she said, Ryan, if you want this big Christmas tree, come and get it. So I did. Now, I was super happy because not only did I get a Christmas tree, but I got a beautiful thing for my table that fits easily under my bed when it's not Christmas time. And there were colored lights all the way perfectly around the tree, more perfect than I had any chance of ever getting them again. So until this year, I had never taken the Christmas lights off the tree. I literally just took the tree and drug it down the hallway when Christmas was over and stuck it in my office. And then I had to sweep up the hallway because it had all those green artificial things everywhere. My mother was not a fan of this theory, but you know, it basically fits. So I just rammed it down the hallway and put it away. Well, this summer I did some pandemic cleaning, like cleaning that I've never done before. And I decided I would have a lot more room in my office if I took the giant Christmas tree out of it and put it under a bed and folded it down. It turns out to do that, you have to take the Christmas tree lights off, which I did by myself. This December, I got the Christmas tree out. I put it up. It was all going well. And then it was time to put the lights on. I tried this by myself. It was a disaster. It looked nothing like Ann. I quit a third of the way up the tree and just stopped. My friend Shauna, who I grew up with, called me. They were coming through town. Her and her children stayed with me for a few days, and she said, you know, Ryan, it's okay to ask us to help you. I said, oh, well, yeah, you're coming tonight. She said, yeah, just ask Lucy to help you. I have a picture of Lucy and I the next morning. Here is Lucy. She's 9 years old, and she's really wonderful. Sorry, you can't see her out there, but she's a wonderful kid. It took some work. It took some patience. It took some help. It took a friend. It took working together in the darkness so that we could later turn on the lights and decorate it. We don't have to decorate the darkness alone. The Magi didn't do anything alone either. Yesterday, I met up with an old friend, Justin James, who many of you know. He now runs an ambulance firm in town. They have more business than they can ever get to every single day. I had just intended to go out and ask a few questions about a computer. I ended up staying an hour. Out in the parking lot, there were several people getting ready to go make calls and runs. They were probably some of the tiredest people I've seen the whole pandemic, these ambulance drivers. We said a few prayers with each other. They looked beat down and tired and working as hard and as long as anyone I could ever imagine. People I have never said a prayer for until that day, the people who drive the ambulances right now. Then Justin said something to me that surprised me. He said, I really appreciate you saying the prayers. But if I had all the money in the world, I wouldn't hire a chaplain, I would hire a counselor, someone for all of my workers and myself to talk to and to be heard and to listen to us every day. That's what I would spend my money on, someone to hear us when we're struggling. He said, you know, around here, mental illness and depression, it used to be kind of a secret. but now it's not even a secret at all. It is in the open. We're all in this together. We're all struggling. It's not just about ambulance drivers. It's about all of us who need a friend. It was a really hard week for all kinds of reasons in this church. We're not ever here alone. It's okay to ask for the preacher to come. It's okay to ask for a counselor. It's okay to ask for a friend. No tree gets decorated alone. It's true not only at Christmas and Epiphany, but all of our lives. Richard Rohr says this, that when we don't find ways to transition our darkness, we transfer it to those we love the most. When we don't find ways to transition our darkness, to deal with it in healthy ways, we will always transfer it to those we love the most. I think it's the lesson of the Magi, obviously scared to death on their journey for all kinds of reasons. And then after being incredibly faithful to Jesus, after following the star all night, after their great journey and sacrifice at a great cost, after giving up everything to worship God, they listen to the darkness. They literally pay attention to the dream they have at night that says the most dangerous and powerful man in the whole world wants you dead. King Herod is his name. He's threatening you. He wants the Christ child dead as well. Everything that's a threat to his empire, he wants gone. This isn't a story about somebody breaking up with decorum. It's a story about a king abusing power at the highest level. And that's when God steps in. I think most stories would end there. But when God steps in, that's not where the biblical story ends. It ends with this overlooked verse number 12 at the very end. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned home another way. And what isn't written, of course, is they returned home together. They helped each other the whole way. In the darkness, they paid attention. In the darkness, they worked together. In the darkness, they kept praying. In the darkness, they rested. In the darkness, they dreamed. In the darkness, they transformed. They didn't despair, but they devised a way to decorate the darkness in a way that the future could be as bright or brighter than the past. But to get there required a willingness to go home a different and unknown way. After a terrible shooting several years ago in Phoenix, Arizona, there was a prominent statesman that was required to stand up to the whole country, and especially those who had died, and give a sermon of sorts. He said this: "We don't get to choose the darkness or evil that finds us, but we always get to choose how we treat one another in its midst. You don't get to you don't get to choose the darkness that finds you, but we get to make a choice how we treat one another when it does." So when we have that choice, God is clear. We choose to love and not to hate. We choose to be for love and not for hate. Whatever amount of grace is needed to do that, it's worth it. Whatever amount of mercy you have to extend to people who have dumped things on you you didn't deserve, it's worth it. Whatever amount of forgiveness you have to give out, even if it's not warranted, it's always worth it. Not just for the sake of your faith, but for the sake of our country. Amen.